Hi, and welcome back to the Logistics Technology Mindmap video series. Bad decisions in logistics technology can cost careers, they can cost companies, or they can make companies and make careers. The role with these talks and the mind map attached to it is to guide you through the steps that I've gone through in my 25 years of working with logistics and technology to ensure that we make the best possible decisions with all the information available that we need at all times. The key factors be deploying the right technology for the right purpose at the right cost, which isn't always the cheapest. Today's session is about security, which if you're an Australian company in 2020, like we are now, you'd be very, very aware that security is front of mind for a lot of big companies. Security is a big one. So if I just zoom out for a second, we cover a fair bit today. So I'm just going to give you the highlights because it is possible to get stuck in the weeds somewhat. We're going to talk about hardware and software. So we're going to talk about cloud, which is probably where we're going to focus a lot of because cloud is potentially where you're exposing your company to the biggest risks. And there are some things to really, really nail and ensure and get it right to begin with, and you're fine. One thing to bear in mind with security, though, it's not a set and forget process. If one has to assume there's an arms race going on in security, and the bad actors or the people who want to get access to things they shouldn't have access to are as well equipped, potentially well funded, and definitely as smart as the people trying to defend. So this isn't a one-off. This is something you have to look at over the time. Let's just drill down a bit more. It's a bit small there. So let's talk about cloud to start off with. So cloud, there's a number of areas: onshore data, offshore data, potential conflicts of interest, and the concept of fencing, which I'll talk about in a sec. So onshore data, you're looking at so cloud, as you guys all know, is the storage of software and your information not physically on your premises. It is physically on someone else's premises though. So the cloud isn't literally vertical. It's going to be stored in a data center somewhere. So when you're looking at that, you need to know that the physical data center itself is secure. That's secure both from a physical hacking, but also for things like power and whatever else. So is it hard to get into your data? And in fact, no one should actually know where your data is. So that's probably a key thing to look for. Then you've got the virtual security aspect of it. So how well protected is your data within that cloud environment? What steps does the company take to ensure that no one can access your data without your permission? Another key thing in Australia is tracking the data ownership. So does your data remain in Australia? Do you own it? Who else might be able to take ownership of that data? What's the fine print in your agreement should someone else wish to put a claim on that data? Something to look at as well is the Australian government access. What steps do you have to take to ensure that either the government should have access that they're legally entitled to or shouldn't have access for things that they may ask for, but you don't want them to have? You also need to look at the data retention policies. So what's required by your organization of the cloud provider to ensure that data that's captured in 2020 is still available in 2027. So it's just a matter of being mindful of those things and asking the questions. This should be a 5-minute meeting with the tech people, but it might not be. A lot of the cloud companies, the big ones, your Amazons, your Googles, Microsofts, Facebook, etc., the data, even though you might be in an Australian data center, the backups or the processing of that data may take place offshore. So that may go to Europe, in which case you need to be aware of GDPR exposure. GDPR is essentially a set of rules that say individuals are entitled to know who has their data, why they have their data. They're entitled to copies of their data on demand, and they're also entitled to the right to be forgotten, which means me as an individual using someone else's cloud software as a member of someone's service or a customer does have the right to write to them and say, please delete me from your system. You've got to be compatible with that if you're going into Europe. There's some questions around security and what happens if your data's in the US. There's suggestions that the various departments within the United States government may have access to your data. Do you want that? Other jurisdictions include China. What happens when you go through the Great Firewall of China? What's available on the other side? What's available on this side? None of this stuff should stop you making a decision to go to offshore, should stop your decision to go into the cloud. But you have to be aware, depending on your industry and the data you're capturing, the level of sensitivity you're sharing, and also be mindful that oftentimes you're sharing data that is your customers or your suppliers' data. So just be aware of where that's going and what's going on with it. Another thing to be aware of is the data transmission. So how secure is it from your premises to the data center or data centers? What is the possibility for someone to clip in and do a man in the middle type attack on that? So how can people tap in and virtually eavesdrop on the line and take your data? Something to be aware of, because that can happen without you knowing. It doesn't happen without you knowing until you get an email saying that we've just got all your data and we're going to release it to everyone unless you pay us $500,000 worth of Bitcoin or something. Don't be scared. There's plenty of people out there to help you with it. And again, it comes down to risk management. So how much do you spend to protect yourself against the weighted risk? Another thing with cloud is just looking at conflicts of interest. So there's two things here. Some of your customers who are direct competitors to the cloud providers may be uncomfortable with the nature of cloud providing. This gets really, really complex if you're using something like AWS, because Amazon has its fingers in so many pies. Your customer may just not be comfortable, or your supplier may not be comfortable with you partnering with one of their direct competitors. So just be aware of those things. Also be aware of how important you're going to be to the cloud provider. If they're targeting everyone in your industry and you're a small player, what are they going to be doing around protecting your interests as a small player, as opposed to be protecting where all their money's coming from, which is the big players? And just looking at that, whether or not the cloud company is a direct competitor to you. So sometimes companies using Google, for example, have found this a fair bit, where they're trying to run stuff on Google Android phones that is in direct competition to how Google makes its money. And what they found belatedly is, after building a business on that platform, they're finding that Google doesn't necessarily want to support them anymore. So just be aware of what might happen. And it can be all great at the beginning and everyone wants everyone's money. But as some of these companies change and pivot, which means change direction, but stay with the same product, they might just be looking at companies like yours and saying, maybe we shouldn't be looking after these competitors anymore. The final thing is with cloud is just make sure that your data and your processes and your systems and your software and everything is running within a virtually fenced off area. So virtually the only way in or out should be via the areas that you control. So your data should be protected because only you can access it, or people you give access to. And you also just have to make sure that there's no potential for cross-contamination with viruses or malware running on the cloud systems. When we say this, and some people are going to be reading this going, that just makes complete sense, surely that wouldn't happen. Don't underestimate the ability of hackers, or the desire of hackers, to get people's data and the amount of work they'll do to get it. That's pretty much the cloud stuff. So hardware, from a security point of view, there's a couple of different things to talk about. I'm just going to read down the list here. So device tracking, if someone's running around with a device that belongs to you, do you know where it is at all times? If it gets stolen or lost, can you secure the device so no one else can access your information? Can you find the device if something happens? What happens to the device when it's lost? What sort of PIN or login are you protecting it with to ensure that, say it's a data terminal, only your drivers can use it? If it's a laptop, what are you doing to protect yourself to ensure that no one can access your secure information on the laptop? It's all well and good to have all the passwords in the world, but if the laptop is protected by the word password, and a bad actor gets that laptop, when they log into something like Google Chrome, which has saved all the passwords, that logging into the laptop might be enough to give them full access into your system. So it's something to really be careful of. What data is on the device as opposed to what data is stored in the cloud. So be really conscious, does everything have to be stored on that device that is particularly vulnerable, or can you have the information shipped off elsewhere? And what networks can that device connect to automatically, and what does it have to be forced to do? There are some default behaviors on some devices that they will automatically connect to any network they can find. A good example of this is if you're at a fast food takeaway place getting a cup of bad coffee, the device might automatically default to connecting to that Wi-Fi network. And essentially then you're just drinking dirty water, because you're you lack all the protection. Anyone in that cafe, anyone with access to that network could potentially hack into the device, and you're not going to know about it. So really be careful about the locking down of the network features for devices and hardware you've got out there. I'll skip BYOD for a second. So more talking about your devices again. Just look at batteries and charging equipment. So from a security point of view, physical security of the device, what are they going to be plugging into? Some USB ports, for example, aren't secure. So if your team member is stopped at an airport anywhere in the world and plugs into a USB and plugs the device in, there is the potential for the device to be hacked through that USB. So how are you protected against that? How can you ensure that every staff member has the correct charging equipment so they don't need to use the public charging spaces? With shared devices, just ensure you know who's on the device at all times. So you need to have some user tracking in there. So if Marshall misbehaves on the device and causes damage to your company, you need to know it was Marshall and not one of the other 15 people that actually were using the device at that time. A real vulnerability here, for example, is a shared dispatch computer where the username might be warehouse dispatch 1, but there's 20 people going through there all day. Who was it who made the mistake or who enabled something or clicked on the pop-up that came through that's then allowed the malware or the virus into your company? You need to be able to track that down because they may have done it unintentionally or they may have done it deliberately. Another thing that's probably more topical now than it's ever been is just it's a question around security around device hygiene. Don't leave yourself open to getting charged, sued, prosecuted, or just having a sick staff member because people weren't sanitizing, they weren't using screen protection and keypad guards. Just be careful with that. So security is obviously the virtual and the digital security, and anyone was looking at biosecurity with the devices. If you're doing anything with farming, you're probably already across this as well, cleaning the gumboots, cleaning the car, etc., etc. But did you clean the phone or the device, the laptop, the PDA, whatever it was, because your employer contractor was touching other things in the farm? So just be wary of that. That's more a behavioral thing, but you need to be able to do that. Software, we touched on already really quickly, but the local or the hybrid model, are you better off being on your local device? Are you potentially going to share hybridization? The more potential touch points in your software, the more likely it is you are vulnerable to someone accessing it. So just be mindful that whatever system you decide on, every single stage should be locked down. And then you've got to balance that with the fact that you want people to be actually able to do their jobs. So every single time I log into your system, I don't want to be having to go and verify by 3 or 4 different methods because I'll stop using the system. But at the same time, at least should I verify that it was me when I logged into the laptop? Just some stuff to look at there. And the final area before I let you go is bring your own device. So BYOD, particularly topical now with so many people working from home on their own laptops. But even when people are bringing laptops and their own iPhones and Android phones into the office or to your customers and suppliers' sites, you've got some issues here around they could be running anything. And what are we going to do to encourage our employees and contractors to have good security behaviors around that? If I'm installing my app as a company onto an employee's phone, how can I ensure that that app isn't going to get hacked by something else the employee has downloaded? There's levels to which you can dictate this. There's levels to which you can't dictate this. But things like shared resources, so we're going to be using Chrome browser, for example, on an Android phone, that's giving all the data off to Google. Is that something we want when our staff members are logging into our system, or should they be using a bespoke browser just for our purposes? The other thing to look at is then employee contractor onboarding, bringing them on. So ensuring that when they bring the device into the company, it's already secured. You don't want to be bringing all the viruses and the malware from a previous company. You don't want them to be hacked by the previous employer, for example. And almost as critical is when they leave. So when someone leaves with their own device, how do we ensure they no longer have access to the software or the apps or the things they've been using? How can we ensure our IP and our data is clearly protected? So that was a big one, security. Thanks for sticking with it. It's critically important. As always, if all this Mindmap stuff you can access whenever you like. If you want to book a strategy session with me, please just hit up askmarsh.com and we'll talk soon. See you later.